Hello, friends, and welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and we want to talk about this very dynamic new moon that's coming up. This is in the context, of course, of several things that are happening in the political situation, and we do want to pay somewhat attention to that. We do have to also pay attention to what's going on with each one of us individually, and that may be completely separated from what's happening in the zeitgeist. However, it may also be in response to that, to some extent, the anxiety in our individual lives may be manifest or not, or the success in our individual lives may be manifest or not. And yet it is affected by what's going on around us and what is happening in the world, where we see the anxieties and the potential for success or not success that is fostered by these, you could say, political events, these world events that are also simultaneously part of our viewpoint right now. So let's take a look at the chart, which, as I say, is a very dynamic chart. So you should be able to see it now. We're using, as usual, the natural chart. That is to say, this is the first house identified with Aries, the second house with Taurus, and so on, rather than seeing a particular ascendant, because, you know, the ascendant will vary depending on your location, depending on your time zone. So right now, the ascendant, we're right now for the West Coast, where we are, the ascendant is actually, let me scan for the ascendant. Okay, here it is. The ascendant at 27 Taurus is actually very close to Uranus. So for the West Coast, this is particularly important, considering that this new moon is happening and is very, very potentially strong. Coming up on Wednesday, June 25th, coming up in the early morning hours of that day, which would be later morning, of course, for the East Coast or for Europe. So what do we got going here? The first thing to notice, I think, is the sun and moon at 4 degrees of Cancer, and of course the sign of Cancer being the sign of this new moon, so there's an emotional quality to it. But additionally to that, we want to say also very closely conjunct, well, look at this, it's around half a degree off. So very closely conjunct with Jupiter, exalted in Cancer, Jupiter at 3.5 degrees of Cancer. And so therefore, we have, in spite of everything, a very optimistic situation here. There is the potential for joy. There is the potential for solutions. There is the potential for seeing the upside, the glass half full, rather than the glass half empty or 3/4 empty or only an eighth of the contents remaining, depending on how cynical we are, how dire we look at the situation that we in the world are in. As I say, individually we may be doing fine, we may be doing difficult, but there's the prospect that everybody's in the midst of with these, you could say, rumors or vibrations of war in the atmosphere, including the two difficult conflicts that we have seen just not get any better. The one in Ukraine, where the fighting goes on, the aggression goes on from Russia to Ukraine. The situation goes on. It's a very difficult situation for the people there. And for Gaza, a very difficult situation for the Palestinians in Gaza as well. And then that gets mixed in with, does Israel have a right to defend itself? Of course it does. Does Israel have a right to exist? Of course it does. And the Israelis. But do they have the right to potentially, wage a genocidal conflict with their enemies and neighbors in terms of the Palestinians and Hamas? That's questionable. So anyway, we can look at this chart and get away from the politics and just see what is all of that is going on here? Why do I say this is such an intense chart? And the reason I say that is because if you look at the outer planet positions, you can see, and they're shaping up this summer to be even more so. What we have is we have Saturn very close to Neptune and in the very early degrees of the sign, 1 degree and 2 degrees of Aries. We have Pluto at 3 degrees moving backward, getting down to 1 degree of also Aquarius, so a sextile. We have this new moon in the very early degrees of Cancer, so in particular it's square alignment with the Saturn and the Neptune. It's a inconjunct or quincunx alignment with Pluto, but these are all very close aspects, so you can just see how the emphasis is on these outer planet things, including the fact that Mars is at 4 degrees of Virgo, so Mars is precisely sextile to the 4-degree mark of this new moon in Cancer, brings Mars very much into the equation. Guess what? Mars is also in a quincunx or inconjunct aspect to Pluto. Mars with Pluto, we know, is the possibility of anger, the possibility of passions arising, the intention to try to be aware of that. If anger does come up, one thing we can do is recognize that the anger may not be identical to the trigger for that anger, which might be some occasion for upset with their neighbor, with their friend, with their housemate, with their lover, with their partner, with their parents even, or whatever. But it is, a friend of mine who's a psychologist has a saying that he's very fond of, that I'm very fond of as well, that we're never angry for the reason that we think we are. In other words, there's buried anger that we have from early childhood wounding, typically, that comes up and gets triggered in certain circumstances, and that's where we can take responsibility for our own anger, and that's a very important factor in all this, which does involve also Chiron, not so much involved in the aspects here, but Chiron in fact has been with Uranus for a long time, which means that we are in some ways more aware than usual of the depths of ourselves, the wound that's there, that we may be able to ameliorate by our loving presence. We want acceptance there, and we want attention there, rather than trying to avoid it because it's painful, so we don't want to go there. So the tendency is to avoid it in youth, when the things first come up, or childhood. And the recipe is not to avoid it in maturity, where we can look at those things and try to understand them, and try to understand where it's coming from, and try to understand that rather than blame anybody else, we might just recognize that it's our own anger that's coming up for us, and we really have to it's our responsibility to deal with that. So the recipe is, when anger comes up, and I'm bringing this up because of the Mars-Pluto that's very prominent in this configuration. When the anger does come up, you step back rather than step forward with your fist out. Try to step back and open your hand. Relax, think about it. Count to 10, but it's very good to avoid the words said in anger, because those words cannot be taken back. They resonate. And so best of all is if you can avoid saying them, and next best if you can recognize what you said and attempt to make repair. You can apologize, you can say, I'm sorry I was carried away, you can say, I recognize that this wasn't really your fault, that things happen, it hit me the wrong way, I'm so sorry, whatever. But that's the best thing to do, is to use your words, say something even after the event if it is possible to do that. You may need to take a break and say, I'll come back to this. I'm sorry, but I can't talk right now. I really need to think about this, or I really need to reflect, or I really need to take a break. Or you could even say, I got a phone call, just a minute. That's the recipe for dealing with it. And what we can see here is, because the Mars is at 4 degrees, and the Sun and Moon is at 4 degrees, and then they're a sextile, and then we have Pluto at 3 degrees. So that's a Yod formation. That's the finger of God, so-called. Bringing a focus to the focal planet of the Yod, which is Pluto, But then, by George, what we can also see in this configuration is it's so powerful, and it's been powerful for a while. This is coming up on June 25th, but also on June 20th, we had the actual entrance of the sun into Cancer, which of course is the Cancer solstice. And at that time, too, Mars was at only 2 degrees, but still we had Jupiter nearby at 2 degrees. We had Mars, so we had that same yod. So it's been brewing for a while. It's been since the 20th. It's been very powerful, and now here we have the 25th, and it's the new moon, and that triggers another configuration. And this is the configuration, and it's very powerful now as well. So in this coming Wednesday event, Wednesday morning. So this is very, very strong stuff. And when I started to say the yod is to Pluto, what's also true is because of Saturn and Neptune in sextile with Pluto, the yod is also to Mars. You can see that there's also an inconjunct from this 1 or 2 degrees here of Aries to the Mars position, and that echoes, and that's with the sextile and also with the inconjunct from Pluto to Mars. So we have a focal point of Pluto and we have a focal point of Mars. And by the way, this is very, very strong. This is very powerful. This is warlike. This is intense. This is the tension of that, the potential for conflict, because Mars is conflict. Mars is about trying to assert your point of view, your ego, your dominance in some cases. With Pluto especially, it can be control and dominance, so power struggles, issues between partners. So we can recognize that this is part of the zeitgeist too. There's also conflict in there's war. I started to say the wars that we're experiencing for all this time recently, the recent months, with Gaza and with Ukraine are now amplified more fully by the potential for the U.S. being brought into that conflict with its great power and its also great ability to be targeted as well. So if it goes to negotiation in the Middle East, we'll be better off, but these don't look like negotiating times. These look like conflict times, difficult times. Lynn Bell, noted astrologer Lynn Bell, also remarked that it is the Mars return recently, not so much right now, but recently, within the last couple of weeks, the Mars return of both the Israel state and also of our president, Trump. His Mars return was just recent also, so that's a kind of a warlike possibility in both of those charts. So anyway, just to say, yod to Pluto, yod to Mars, difficult situation, takes extreme caution, extreme using our heads. What we have also, and it's a good thing, is we have Mercury at 28 degrees of Cancer, speaking of using our heads, right, our mentality, our consciousness, and Uranus at 29, that's another sextile. So this sextile contributes also to the extent that we have a consciousness about these things. We can use our mental faculties, is what I meant to say, to try to understand better. And with Uranus, there's going to be surprises there. There's surprises and the possibility for surprise revelation. Uranus is also about revelation. It's about discarding the rules, discarding the past, discarding what we thought we had to do, discarding conventions, and going it from a new standpoint, trying to find a new way. You can find perhaps a third way where there was only two. You can perhaps find a third way out. You can maybe see how to go above or below or around and synthesize and find a new path that there wasn't one before. Sometimes you can create a new path. So that's what Uranus with Mercury is all about, and it does bring up the potential for really, kind of finding our way through. So that's the good news. That's the plus side as well as the Jupiter side, because Jupiter is giving us that feeling of optimism that we maybe could find a way through this, or that even if we don't find a way through this, there may be something of value in the shakeup. It might be that old patterns were entrenched and were deleterious in many ways, and these patterns of either the way the world was, the way the Middle East was, the way our own government was before this most recent change of the party change of the administration that we've had, there may be a value, if it's being shaken up in certain ways, which it certainly is, there might be a value in that shakeup in the long run, because we can see in certain of the actions of the Trump administration a caricature of the self-interest, the money makes right, the might makes right, that we've had for a long time in this country. So that's not new with Trump. And so it's very important to recognize that there could be value even in the extremity if we take it the right way, band together and try for the light. We really have to try for the light. And everybody's involved to some extent in this. There's been massive demonstrations saying, let's not be mean, let's not be cruel, let's be kind. Instead of that, and that brings up Haumea and Makemake, which have to do with that, because Haumea and Makemake, they're new planets, they're new 21st century astronomical discoveries. I've been researching them because I think anything that's declared as a planet is powerful. Case in point, Pluto, declared as a dwarf planet by the recent IAU meeting that they had in 2006. And guess what? Uranus, also declared at that time as a planet, as a dwarf planet, a kind of planet, I say, and very important in charts, as important as Pluto in charts, very significant, has to do with a feminine warrior, which means a warrior for depth purposes. So a feminine warrior or spiritual warrior in support of soul intention. And that's very powerful. It's been shown over and over again. Astrologers are beginning to go along with that now. Well, what about the other two? So Haumea and Makemake also declared as dwarf planets in this 2006-2008 timing of the IAU, the International Astronomers Union. And they are important in charts. I've been able to demonstrate that. And they do have to do with a connection to nature, a profound connection to nature, which is an important factor we're neglecting. Has to do with the mystical side of life to some extent, as recognizing that as important as the rational side, the non-rational, the mystical. Synchronicity, as Jung called it, things happening for a reason, but you can't see the connection in terms of a causal. It's an acausal connection or a non-causal connection. So looking at Haumea in this way, and we see that it's very very much a part of all these outer planet configurations where and there's a quincunx from Haumea or from Saturn and Neptune to Haumea, and also the 0 degree mark of Gemini, which Uranus is only half a degree away from there. It will be, incidentally, in Gemini on the 7th of July. So this brings up yet another yod. So the sextile between 1 degrees of Gemini and 1 degrees of Aries to this 1 degree Scorpio position of Haumea. So again, a yod featuring Haumea. Haumea is square Pluto, and that's getting stronger because Pluto's moving backwards to 1 degree, and Haumea is stationing right here. So there's really a tremendous amount of energy, including these new planets, including the idea that kindness counts, that truth counts, that telling the truth about the situation matters, trying to be in our personal connections with people as honest as we can be, to enable them to be dealing with the same facts that we're dealing with, because if we lie about the facts, we're misleading people. And if the administration or any politician lies about the facts, they're misleading people. And we see a lot of that going on right now. So the counter to that is let the truth come out. I've seen that over and over again with Pluto and with Haumea like this in that square, when triggered, when it's featured in charts because of other factors, and these other factors are contributing very strongly right now. So the Haumea square with Pluto, excuse me, is very much in our face right now as well. So the basic message here, with all of this strong activity that's going on here, is to recognize that we're in a tough situation. And we just have to admit that. There's no papering over that. And yet, on the other hand, we have our individual agency, very important. We have our own truth we can tell. We have our own standard we can adhere to. We can go to what we deeply believe ourselves. That's our bottom line. We can articulate that. We can take a stand for that. We can demonstrate in the streets, we can vote with our money, we can vote with our economic activity, and we can vote with our actual vote when the November 26 elections come around. And all these things are very important right now. So with that, I think I will transition back to the other view and just say that with all this intensity, this amazing, crazy intensity we have right now in the world and within ourselves, perhaps too, we can always seek the light. We can always seek the high road. We can always try to make the best of it. We can always have some faith in ourselves, faith in the universe to see us through. We live in a meaningful universe, and that is more and more evident. And the fact that astrology works is actually a miracle as well. How could astrology work? It's just the positions of the planets, and yet it tells us so much. It just invariably tells us about an individual nativity birth chart that we look at. And the factors that everybody works with those factors. It's not a fate. It's a thing you can work with, but it's there. It's there to work with. So that's what we have in our current situation in the world as well, something we can work with. And it's tough, but we can do it. So good luck with that. Take care.